This call left the judge in utter disbelief. The oak-paneled courtroom had the kind of hush that felt like velvet soft, but absolute. It folded the sound of shoes and the low murmur of papers into itself, leaving only the measured boom of the clock above the bench and the slow scrape of a chair as someone shifted their weight. Light slanted through tall windows, cutting the room into bars of dust and gold. Henry Miller sat behind the mahogany bench, as he had for nearly 30 years. A small man hemmed in by robes, an economy of movement that suggested everything, and revealed little. His voice, when he spoke, smoothed disputes into order. His hands, when they moved, made rulings that became days and lives. Then laughter. A thin, astonished burst from the public gallery, a ripple at first, a reaction to something incongruous in the room. Henry glanced over the rim of his glasses, and the scene to his left put something like vertigo into his chest. A toddler in a pink dress, hair in two uneven pigtails, standing in the court's well, clutching a rectangle of light. Her cheeks were still flushed from the run of it. There was a small smear of jam near the corner of her mouth. She held the phone up like an offering and, with the grim concentration of a child trying an important spell, pressed a single button. No one moved for an instant. A bailiff shifted his jaw. A lawyer in the front row inhaled sharply. The toddler's voice was thin but clear. "Mommy?" And then, by way of child logic, she reached again for the screen, and tapped until the device answered, a small chirp of connection. For a judge, order has a sanctity. Henry had presided over hearings where tempers were worn down to paper thinness, where the precise place of a comma in a contract decided custody and credit. He had been good at not being seen at, letting the law stand like a polished statue between him and human mess. That day, something in the bright absurdity of the child holding a stranger's instrument of modern life under the chandelier and pressing buttons made him laugh, as unexpected as a hiccup from the chest. It was not the warm, indulgent laugh people imagine older men have for children. It was the startled sound of a man whose metronome had missed a beat. The laughter was a sound in the room, and then, instantaneously, it was swallowed by a silence that felt bigger than the noise. The toddler had dialed. The voice that answered came through the speaker low, caught between surprise and a smile. "Dad," the woman said. 2 syllables. The courtroom seemed to sag under them. Henry's laughter died, the way any hurried thing dies when confronted by truth. Abruptly, with a clench. The word was not a petition. It was not a name called in evidence. It was a small, intimate naming that belonged nowhere near his role. And yet, there it was, clear as a bell in the echoing room. His hands never still, always moving to organize papers, to tap his gavel, to rearrange the distance between people, with the phrase rested. On the bench, the grooves of his palm, the blue veins, the calluses from long years of penmanship, were suddenly the only things he could observe. Mia clutched the phone, as if it were the center of the world, and said, in the thin cadence of a child trying to help bring Mommy. The court reporter's fingers paused mid-rhythm. A woman in the gallery put her hand to her mouth. Henry felt something like a fall. The way the air in his lungs tightened, the way color left his face. Those were physical facts, but layered beneath them, like the sediment beneath water, were other things. The silence that had grown between him and a woman he had known as a child. With bright, impatient hands. The year of dinners, unshaped. The months when he chose procedure over relation, language over listening. He had ruled in rooms full of people whose lives were based on his words. He had always told himself the law was how he loved. Fair, impartial, envy. It had taken him a lifetime to make that idea feel sturdy. And now, with Dad moving through a speaker held by a child in a pink dress, the structure of that idea seemed, suddenly, less certain. "Your Honor," Benjamin the bailiff said, voice low, as if the word could wake the building. Henry swallowed. He had to do something that judges learn in training. Not to make the courtroom about the person, but to let the institution remain intact. But there are moments when the institution's seams must give way to the person inside them. The toddler tightened her fingers. On the view of Henry's face, there was a syllable of recognition that no official robe could hold. He rose from the bench, and the movement felt like shedding armor. He did not speak over the room. He did not call the matter to order. He walked down the steps. Slow, each movement, a small betrayal of the dignity he had been taught to perform. The clear line between the man and the office blurred when he reached the marble at the base of the bench. There, in front of strangers and plaintiffs and reporters whose pens had stilled, he crouched, because there was no other posture that would fit what he felt. He took the phone from Mia with hands that trembled, and the world narrowed to the sound of the woman's voice, through a piece of glass and circuitry, and a child's gesture. Isabella's voice was softer than he'd remembered, but it was the precise timbre that made pictures rise of scraped knees and late-night homework, of a laugh that had once been wired to a different frequency. "Dad," she said again. No greeting, no preface. He tried to answer with the presumptions of his office. Isabella, a lawyerly opening that smelled faintly of admonition, but the heater of his chest was already in motion. He had no time for ceremonial language. He felt his jaw work, the way words close a gate. Instead, he heard himself say, "Isabella." She spoke then, and his knees went hollow. "They're giving me chemo," she said. The words landed like pebbles. There was no technical cataloging, no medical theater. She did not ask him to make promises of miraculous cures. She said it as one says what is true. Plain and startling. "Mia wanted to call you," she added, and for a moment Henry could hear paper rustle, the faint drag of hospital machinery, a voicemail of breath. Mia's small hand found his thumb. Her fingers were warm and sticky. "The physical affirmation of the moment," she said, again with the hopeful simplicity of someone for whom the world is contingent on action. "Bring Mommy." The sentence had prayer and instruction in it at once. Around Henry, people whispered, pulled their coats closer, leaned forward, because nobody could look away. The memory arrived like a film strip long, and detailed and cruel in its timing. Henry saw an office, high-ceilinged and neat, a summer afternoon that had smelled faintly of copier toner, and the faint sweetness of strawberry shampoo. Isabella had come to him months earlier, with a request that involved the law and, more acutely, trust. She had asked him to protect her child from an ex who had been neglectful, a man whose absences had been routine until they had become dangerous. She had pleaded with him in the language of a parent at the edge of fear. "Please, Dad." The plea had been bound to paternal desperation. Henry had listened. He had done what he almost always did. He had translated danger into procedure. "Filed the proper documents," he told her. His voice soft, because he had thought that sounded like care. "Gather evidence? Consult? Counsel? The court will not decide on rumor," he had told her, with an authority that masked fatigue, that he could not and would not bend the institution to spur-of-the-moment impulses. The law was a shield, sometimes, he believed. It was the only shield that could be trusted. She left his office with the kind of look that dissolves slowly, an exhaustion that older men sometimes mistake for arrogance in younger women. She had shut a door without shouting. She had been gone 2 years. He had kept to his schedule after that meeting. He had sat through hearings. He had signed orders. He had pronounced sentences. He had been the man who does not mistake love for favor. He had kept his life measured by calendar blocks. He had not called. He had counted silence as a kind of justice. Back in the present, Isabella's voice trembled. "I didn't?" she began, then paused, then spoke again with a fragility that sharpened what she said. "I didn't know who to call. Henry's hands, large for a judge who had spent his life accounting for fine legal distinctions, found the child's hair and felt the tiny crown of sweat at the nape. He became, in that instant, the man who once carried a child on his shoulder across a playground. The robe he wore did not change the reality under his skin. He had a daughter who was ill, and she had the right to his attention. The courtroom reacted in a humane cascade of exhalations. The kind judge is no longer here. A woman sniffed into a handkerchief. An older man drew his breath and held it, as if to see how the world might rearrange itself. Henry felt something behind his stern jaw shift. He was, for the first time in a long while, He rose fully and spoke then, but not from the bench. He spoke with the low, measured cadence a man uses when he is about to change the terms of his life. Given circumstances, he said, voice steady and small, I will recuse myself from any matters involving this case. I cannot, in good conscience, preside. He did not attempt to adjudicate custody in that hallway. He would not. DNA had to be verified. Process observed. He was a judge who respected his own court, but he would not preside over what had become personally charged. The filing came later. Formal papers. A notice of recusal that would, as it should, route the case to another judge. It was an act of procedure. And also, the first act of personal admission. The legalities were precise and sterile. A written notice, a clerk's signature, ADSI mento. Henry signed what needed signing with a hand that trembled not from uncertainty about the law but from newfound knowledge that his life had been misaligned. He left the bench, not in triumph, but in a kind of humble surrender. Outside the courtroom, in the narrow corridor that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books, Henry sat on a bench and closed his eyes. The building hummed with the everyday. Someone filing a complaint downstairs, the sound of heels in the corridor, the distant drone of traffic. In his pocket, the phone vibrated with messages he had yet to open. He let his head fall forward and, in that position, allowed himself the small, dangerous luxury of remembering. In the flashback he had not noticed before, Isabella's hands had been steady as she held his. There had been no theatrics. There had been raw fatigue and a kind of professional urgency. She had been a pediatrician then. Her voice had handled crises in clinical tones that were precise and calm. She had told him about Robert in a way that suggested a pattern. Missed visits, excuses, promises without follow-through. Henry had listened. He had been good at listening. It had been the vocation of his life. But listening does not always require action. And sometimes the person who thinks they are protecting an institution convinces themselves they are protecting people. He realized then that his silence had been a thing that collected and hardened. 2 years had gone by, and they had not exchanged dinners. They had not spoken on birthdays, or on small calls that were easy to make. He had curated his life around service, and had presumed that the service would stand in for a father's love. That presumption had been a quiet betrayal. When he rose, the corridor felt colder. He walked to the clerk's office, filed the recusal notice in official ink. He waited while the clerk found paper, stamped, sealed. The document would ripple through bureaucratic layers, and land finally on another bench for adjudication. That was law's way of dealing with human trouble. To remove the person who is too close, and let an institutional mechanism take over. But recusal was only the beginning. If Isabella was sick, it meant that the other work he'd so carefully separated from his life files, records, the things he trusted had to be attended to in a different way. He could not repair 2 years of silence with a single piece of ink. He needed to know specifics, not in order to rule, but in order to help. He set his jaw and began what he had always done best: gather facts. Not to render judgment, but to understand the texture of what had happened. He went to the archival room, a place he rarely visited in person because it was the kind of work his clerks did, the mechanical sifting of paper and tape. The archive smelled like dust and ironing starch, like a museum of past lives. Boxers were stacked on metal shelves, each labeled in neat, indifferent handwriting. He ran his hand over a cardboard lid and felt the grit of old paper. Gerald was the archivist, a small man with a fedora, and the patient eyes of someone who had been asked to keep histories for longer than he expected. He moved with the careful deference of someone who had spent his career arranging other people's pasts. The two of them had known each other for years. Gerald had a way of saying nothing and offering everything. He had a laugh that came slowly, and a memory for the shape of a document that was uncanny. "You need a file, Judge?" Gerald asked, not looking surprised to see Henry. He knew Henry's handwriting, and he knew how Henry thought. That paperwork could map a life, Henry told him. Not in legalese, but in the rough, honest language of a man who had just been named. Records on Robert Carter, any reports, complaints, anything to do with neglect, missed custody exchanges, complaints filed by social services. Gerald blinked. He slid a cart forward, tire tracks whispering on linoleum. "We keep the filings from the past decade," he said. "You'll have to tell me the approximate dates." The dates were not what Henry wanted to be precise about. He wanted to know whether patterns existed, not just whether a single incident had occurred. He wanted the texture, the repetition. He gave Gerald the range he knew from memory, the years that corresponded to Mia's life. Gerald pushed the cart through narrow aisles of boxers until they stopped beneath a single fluorescent light. They worked with the kind of quiet energy that people who love digging into files have, a reverence for paper, and a sorrow for what it can contain. Gerald handed Henry a stack police reports, a single social services letter, the note of a custody dispute filed years earlier, and withdrawn. Henry read. The handwriting of other lives became legible in his hands. There it was. A note about missed visitation, then a pattern calls placed and unreturned, promises that were excuses. The records did not shout. They repeated a whisper against the page. Henry found himself scratching along the margins. A man making notes on someone else's history. He felt oddly intimate with Robert's absences. The pattern of neglect was less sensational and more mundane. Forgotten dates. A job that required him to be out of town. An ex-husband who misplaced promises the way some men misplaced keys. There was a file on a minor safety complaint at Robert's apartment. A note from a neighbor who heard a child crying late into the night and felt the pull to call social services. The files did not indict with dramatic flair. They painted the portrait of a man who was often not present. For Henry, the discovery had a double effect. On one hand, it supplied the evidence his daughter had sought months ago, the things she had been told to assemble and present to courts that value documentation. On the other, it made him feel complicit for not having insisted on a different kind of attention earlier, an attention not predicated on legal thresholds. The law had rules for neglect, for endangerment. There were thresholds and burdens of proof and hearings and process. There were also the quiet hours of a father's failure to call. He let one file fall on the desk and rubbed his thumb over the corner, as if the paper might give him an answer if he did not try too hard to force it. He thought of Isabella in her hospital room, of her voice saying "they're giving me chemo" without the flourish of theatrics. He thought of Mia with jam on her chin, the child's simple command that an adult bring mommy be returned to a small family. A memory of Elizabeth passed in front of Henry, a woman he had once shared a life with and who had become, over the years, a pragmatic mediator between past and present. Elizabeth had always been careful with words, the kind of person who fixed the edges of a conversation before it frayed into something less salvageable. She had sent him a note the week before, small, tactful about keeping lines open. He had not written back. His pride had been an elegant piece of furniture in his life, the kind you maintain until it becomes an obstacle. The files provided a map, but not a cure. Henry understood the limits of information. He also understood what the next steps could not be. He could not, as a man who had made a career out of separating office and life, suddenly claim authority and rewrite the process. He could, however, make decisions as a father, He could, at the very least, show up. He found the number for Isabella's clinic in an appointment card wedged inside a ledger. The digits were not a solution, they were an access point. He called, asked for a nurse, left his name with a voice that sounded older than his ID. The receptionist promised to pass on a message. He waited without expecting any gratitude. When he returned to his chambers that evening, the robe had been replaced with a cardigan. He walked through rooms lined with law books. These were the things that had ordered his life. He sat in his armchair and put his head in his hands. The house was empty of the people who had once lived within it. It was full of the echo of his choices. He took out a small shoebox he kept in the bottom drawer. The one with small mementos. A matchbox car, a kindergarten scribble with large letters spelling Dad. A photograph of a birthday cake with a single candle, and a smooth gray stone Mia had once given him during a brief visit years ago, taken on a walk along an overgrown path. The stone was warm. Henry had forgotten it. He turned it over, as if it could provide an argument. It was nothing legal, no precedent, no doctrine. It was a pebble that had been smoothed by water, by time. He pressed his thumb into the indented spot on its side, and felt the thin, fierce sensation of wanting to do better. His first act of presence was small and clumsy. He called Elizabeth. Later that night, she answered after 2 rings. The voice calm. "I heard," she said. "I did what I should have done sooner," he admitted without preface. He did not ask for absolution. He wanted to be understood as a man who had, until that afternoon, believed his stewardship of law had been care. "Then call Isabella," Elizabeth said. "Not now. Later, when it's a time of day she can take calls. Tell her you will come," he agreed. He did not say how he would arrange it. He simply said he would. The next morning he filed the formal recusal notice. He wrote a short letter, precise, not confessional, to the clerk of court, outlining reasons that rendered his continued participation inappropriate. The letter was not an emotional outpouring. It was a professional instrument of responsibility. He then requested permission to review the documents associated with the external complaint to the extent permitted by court rules. He was careful. He knew where the law ended, and where his private obligations began. When another judge was assigned to the Kassan, even-tempered woman with the reputation for a gentle but firm hand, Henry met her briefly in the hallway, and offered a concise briefing. He did not preside. He provided factual support, only in the sense of handing over the files he had reviewed. That was all the institution allowed him to do without creating a conflict. But a man cannot fix what is private with only institutional acts. Henry bought a one-way plane ticket and packed a small bag. He placed the gray stone in the pocket of his cardigan, where it was warm against his chest. He did not tell his clerks why he was leaving. He told no one the depth of his urgency. He was not yet sure if he was driven by penance, by fear, or by love. He only knew the pressure inside his ribs was unbearable if he did not act. Before he left, he spent 1 slow hour at his chamber's desk, reading the files again. He looked at dates and patterns, at notes that tracked missed visits, at names of witnesses who had been frustrated by a man who could not be relied upon. Robert's pattern did not scream danger so much as it murmured neglect. The incremental behavior of absence. Those murmurs, when left unaddressed, gather into storms. In his pocket, the phone vibrated with a message from Isabella that said, simply, "I'm glad Mia called. When can you come?" He had not expected anything so immediate. The message did not ask for forgiveness, it asked for presence. He closed the file and stood, the paper whispering like a last breath. The courthouse smelled like wax and dust, and the faint temps of coffee gone cold. Outside, the city exhaled into afternoon. He walked down the courthouse steps, with the stone in his hand, the weight of it ordinary and exact. He thought of the child in the pink dress, of jam on a chin, of the small, momentous gesture that had cut through years of silence. As he hailed a cab, the world ran on around him indifferent. A man in a suit hurried past with a briefcase. A couple walked dogs. A bus roared by spraying mud at the curb. Henry's heartbeat matched the rhythm of the city. He felt vulnerable, in a way he had not permitted himself to feel since he first raised a gavel. He also felt something else, an odd, fragile hope, like the thin green of a shoot pushing through pavement. The flight took him across a patchwork of fields and small towns. Henry watched from the window as the land shrank into a tapestry, and with it, the careful delineations he had assigned to his life. He had made so many decisions as a judge to keep the structure of law intact. Now, the structure of his life demanded a different kind of answer. He landed in a small airport and took a cab to the address on a medical form that Gerald had found in the files. A hospital that smelled of antiseptic and lilies. He sat in his car for a minute in the hospital parking lot, looking at the building's glass facade reflecting sun. He thought of Mia's hand finding his thumb in the courtroom. He thought of the 2 words that had undone him. Dad and Bryn Mommy. Inside the hospital, corridors run like neutral arteries. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency. The world there was a series of small, decisive tasks. Draw blood, change a dressing, recalibrate a drip. Henry walked as if lessons of procedure had taught him the way through, but his feet were guided by something older. Memory of a daughter's small hands, of lullabies, hummed off-key in the dark. Isabella was in a room on the 3rd floor. He stopped before entering, allowed himself to breathe, and then knocked. The doorway framed her like an image he had kept in a private album. She looked diminished by illness, by not a race still. A woman with the precision of a pediatrician, who fixed tiny, broken things for a living. Her hair was thinner at the temples, a small shock against the oval of her face. There were dark rings beneath her eyes. She looked at him and, for a fraction of a second, he saw the old impatience, the fierce competence that had once embarrassed him with its intensity. "Dad," she said again, and this time it was not a call through a device, but an address in a room full of medical machines, and the small hum of a life sustained. He sat on the edge of the bed like a man who had crossed a bridge. He held her hand. The act was simple and, in its simplicity, heavy with the force of a possible new life. He did not make promises of cures. He did not offer speeches. He listened. He learned, acutely, how to listen without converting pain into policy. For once, his decisions were practical and immediate. He arranged for a meeting with Isabella's clinic social worker. He offered to come to court hearings as a witness to the pattern he had found in the archives. As evidence, nothing more. He volunteered to pick Mia up from daycare that afternoon, and to bring soup. He tried, clumsily and earnestly, to be a father. Isabella watched him with the wary hope of someone who had been disappointed before. "You could have called," she said, not accusatory, but tired. "I thought doing my job was the way to help," he said. "I thought," he trailed off. Words failed where silence had done its damage. She smiled, small and private. "Well," she said, "being a judge doesn't protect you from being a father." There was a long, ordinary silence after that. He thought of the bench, of oaken ritual, and allowed himself to understand that robes were not the only thing that could hold him upright. When he left the room, Mia ran full speed into his arms. The child's small body fit under his chin the way it once had in other images of his fatherhood, and the sensation of that closeness was almost unbearable, and almost entirely what he wanted. In the hospital parking lot later, Henry held the smooth gray stone Mia had given him in his hand. It was the same pebble from his drawer. Slightly cooler now. He turned it over and over like an amulet, like a contract he intended to keep. He did not know what the future held, how Isabella's treatment would proceed, whether recovery would be steady, whether legal processes would move in a way that protected the child. He knew only that the small acts of being present could not be encoded into precedent. but were necessary. Nevertheless, the stone was unremarkable. It had no legal force, no ability to order papers or compel testimony. But as he put it into his pocket and walked toward his car, he felt the beginning of a different kind of verdict forming within him. That a life of service meant not only administering justice but being available when blood called for care. He drove back to the city with dirt ridges on the road and the hum of tires. The courthouse would take the files and docket the case. Another judge would rule where rules applied. He had recused himself properly. He had not overstepped the bounds of his office. He had, for the first time in a long while, chosen to step down from a role that had shielded distance, and assumed that distance was protection. There were practical things to be done, calls to social workers, meetings to attend, evidence to present through proper channels. There were personal things, too. Dinners to be shared, a garden to rebuild, stories to be told to a child before sleep. It was not heroic. It was not grand. It was ordinary work, and perhaps that ordinariness was the truest kind of redemption. He sat in the passenger seat of his car, the stone warm against the fabric, and allowed himself to be present to one small fact. The call had arrived in the middle of a courtroom, transforming an ordinary hearing into the pivot on which a life would swing. People would tell the story later and call it astonishing. The toddler, the dialed number, the judge left in disbelief. They would be right about the instant. But the rest of the story would be quieter and longer. A slow learning of what it means to answer. If you enjoy stories like this one's, that begin in an ordinary place, and find the extraordinary in a child small, and subscribe for more. He began. Then, the labor of making amends not in a single gesture, but in persistent attendance. He would read the files again, talk to Gerald, confer with the social worker. He would travel for appointments when asked, and he would learn how to braid the small tasks of custody and care into a life he had thought was already complete. Yet even as he resolved himself to action, a new worry had taken root. The discovery in the archives suggested a pattern, but patterns require proof. The mechanics of evidence and the patience of process would need steady hands. He had to be careful not to collapse the law into personal impulse. That balance between a public role and private obligation would be where his work lay in the days ahead. Henry put the stone back into his pocket and closed his fist around it, as if to feel against his palm the roughness of responsibility. He walked toward the courthouse steps. Again, not as a man returning to a throne, but as someone who had been called to put down a shield and pick up, instead, a small, humble task. To be there, with steady hands and less certainty, and to listen when silence had already done its damage. He walked back into routine not as a man resuming a script he'd long memorized, but as someone learning a new language. The courthouse hummed with its ordinary business motions filed, calendars set. Jurors shepherded through doors, but Henry's movements had a different intent. Where before his days were marked by the cadence of procedure, now they were punctuated by return calls, appointments, and the small logistics of care. He had recused himself. The law would do its part. He would do his. Gerald was waiting in the archives the next morning with a thermos and patience. They pored over the boxes again. Now not as a judge verifying proof, but as a man trying to understand the life of another father who had failed to show up. They made copies, organized a chronology, and labeled a thin binder in handwriting Henry felt embarrassed. Bite, neat. And then to write. If the motion of his pen could erase 2 years. You doing this, for the record, or for your daughter? Gerald asked once, pushing a stack toward Henry, with the gentleness of someone who handles brittle things. Both, Henry said. He could have lied. He chose not to. The truth sat between them, like an unvarnished fact. With documents in hand, he sought out Isabella's attorney that afternoon. Croix de Fostar. He had been in the courtroom that day. One of the loose ends of legal life met Henry, in a small conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and legal pads. Claude was younger, quick of smile, and blunt, where Henry had been cautious. "So, you're taking a hands-off approach?" Claude asked, studying Henry's face. "I am stepping away from the bench," Henry said. "I will not, and cannot, preside. I can, however, provide evidence I uncovered and coordinate with counsel as a father. Not as a judge." Claude nodded slowly. "We can use it. We will file these as exhibits. The court will want social work assessments, and if necessary, a home study. We'll ask for supervised visitation for Robert if the record supports it. We'll keep the child's safety front and center." Henry listened. The legal terms were its own language, less intimate than the small, human chores he was already learning to inhabit, but necessary. He handed the binder over and watched the lawyer flip through reports, pages sliding like leaves. "I'll make myself available for whatever is appropriate," Henry said. He thought of how strange it felt to offer, to be a resource without claiming power. "If it helps to sit in the courtroom as family, I will." Claude looked up. "Don't make it about you," he said simply. "Make it about Isabella and Mia." Henry agreed. It was an admonition and an instruction. The practicalities: scheduling, childcare, transportation arrived in stacks the way small, vital work often does. The social worker assigned to Isabella, a woman named Priya, was efficient in a way that warmed Henry. Priya had seen enough family crises to move a certain way through them. Deliberately, with measurement. She asked questions that cut to the bones. Who is the primary caregiver? What is the support network? Are there current safety concerns? Her pen ticked against a pad of forms. Her voice was even. Henry answered hesitantly at first, then with the clarity of someone who had taken time to look through files and to sit in hospital rooms. He provided contact details, dates, and the chronology Jarrah had assembled. He explained, with awkwardness, that he had discovered a pattern of absence in Robert Carter's record, and had copies to contribute. He did not offer judicial weight to what he provided. He gave them as a father who had collected facts to help a daughter. Priya nodded, and set tasks: a home visit, interviews with daycare, and an assessment of the child's immediate needs. For the first time in months, Henry felt the small, magisterial pleasure of being useful in a purely human register. Henry learned to find ordinary rhythms. He learned route options to a daycare center 2 neighborhoods over. He learned how to carry grocery bags while holding a child's hand. The first time he buckled Mia into a car seat, his fingers trembled and then found root in the same motion his father had used decades earlier. Mia nodded at him with sovereign confidence, as if she had appointed him to an office only she could grant. Those afternoons were a geography of small things that stitched him back into family life. The scrape of a spoon on a bowl of soup he learned to make by watching Isabella show him how. A bedtime story, clumsily read but steady in voice. A game of make-believe that required him to be an obstacle only to be architecturally outwitted by a preschooler. He learned the scent of strawberry shampoo again, and the sound of a child counting to 3. While she decided whether a stuffed bear would be allowed at dinner. He learned to listen without translating feelings into precedent. Isabella's days folded into treatment schedules and check-ins. Henry sat in waiting rooms, with cups of hospital tea, listening to the small rituals that made long medical days. Bearable phone calls from concerned colleagues, a neighbor dropping off lasagna, the way a nurse would straighten a blanket, and joke about bad daytime television. He was not a doctor. He was a man whose tools were steadiness and presence. Those tools were sometimes enough. Months of practical work gave way to formal proceedings. Claude filed the exhibits Henry had provided. Priya compiled assessments. The court's calendar assigned a hearing. Another judge, Judge Marin, presided, stern but fair. Someone with a reputation for weighing child welfare above rhetoric. Henry did not preside. He sat in the gallery, on a hard bench that had none of the velvet of the courtroom he had occupied for years, and he watched the law move as it should. Methodically, with lawyers presenting evidence, with social workers testifying to need, with a tribunal working to safeguard a child's best interests. Robert's lawyer argued for more time, for a more generous visitation schedule, and for the assumption that absence did not necessarily translate to incapacity. Robert himself sat in a corner, sometimes furtive, sometimes speaking with a voice that tried to sound steady. He promised change in the halting way. Men often promise, with plans and lists, with intentions. The record, however, showed a trail of inconsistencies that could not be willed away by sincerity alone. The files Gerald had helped assemble presented patterns, missed exchanges, neighbor complaints, a thread of excuses that added up. Priya spoke plainly about home conditions and routines. She read from notes, daycare reports, noting late pickups, a neighbor's observation about an unlocked gate at a time a child was alone, the record of missed benefit appointments. She spoke of safety as a function of presence and planning, not as moral condemnation. Claude cross-examined with care. Robert's counsel pushed back. The judge listened to all. In the audience, Henry's heart performed a peculiar double motion once, as a man who had been part of the system, now as someone acutely fragile, in the face of his daughter's life. He kept his hands folded, concealing the small granite object in his palm. The gray stone Mia had given him, warmed by his skin. Judge Moran's ruling was careful. There would be a parenting plan that prioritized Isabella's custody, provisional measures for Robert including mandatory parenting classes, supervised visitation, and a requirement for regular reports to the social worker and to the court. The judge ordered a home study and set a timeline for reviewing the plan's success, all the while making plain that the court's obligation was to the child's safety, not to panegyrics of intention. It was not a grand vindication by the standards of drama. It was, instead, the slow accretion of safeguards into a structure that could permit a child to flourish. Henry felt both relief and an echo of guilt, a recognition that decades of uptime in service did not exempt him from the very human mistakes he'd made as a father. The law had done its job. He would have to do his. Isabella's treatment progressed in ways that were hopeful, and in ways that were simply the steady, uncertain work of medical chemistry and care. There were scans that read more kindly than those at the beginning. There were days when the chemo made her dizzy, and days when she laughed with the same clipped, controlled humor she used at work. Henry learned not to count the days of improvement as absolutes. There were no miraculous endings written in his pocket stone, but as probabilities shaped by small acts. Going to appointments, riding out hard nights, allowing others to help. Mia, with the matter-of-fact wisdom of children, marked the passage of time by things that mattered to her. A new library sticker next to her name, a successful attempt at tying shoelaces, a picture carefully painted with a sun, and 4 stick figures too small, too large. Each image was a ledger of presence, who showed up that day and who did not. As Isabella regained strength, the household they carved together learned new rituals. Henry taught Mia how to plant seeds in a small plot of earth behind Isabella's modest house. She favored sunflowers, and dug with small hands that loved to soil. They made soup in batches, and froze the excess in labeled containers. Henry learned to listen for more than legal argument in the small interchanges, the electric buzz of adolescence, the way a daughter talked about work, and the ethics of pediatric care, with exacting insistence. The distance between them, once defined by silence and doctrine, narrowed by repetition. Elizabeth came around, not as a rescuer, but as a pragmatic presence. She brought pies and paperwork, and sometimes merely a sense of continuity. She had married and unmarried different seasons of Henry's life, and had acquired, over the years, an art of quiet mediation. When she arrived at the house with a thermos and a stack of cooling racks, her eyes held the same wry compassion that had marked their years together. "You look less formal," she said once. watching Henry pull on a worn cardigan, a small concession to domesticity. "I feel less formal," he replied. They stood on the small porch together, and watched Mia chase a neighbor's dog with the disregard of a young general. Elizabeth touched his forearm lightly. "You don't get to fix everything," she said, "but you can be here." "That's what I'm trying to do," Henry said. He meant it, with the sober force of someone who had discovered a new axis of purpose. Time was not a linear cure. There were relapses in mood, days when everything felt raw, and the old measure of success seemed like a lie. There were nights when Isabella's hair fell out in clumps despite her attempts at lightness, when Henry would sit in the kitchen with a hand on the stone in his pocket, and feel the old fear twinge. There were appointments when tests were ambiguous and the world was made of waiting rooms. And yet, alongside the waiting, there was work. Henry learned the choreography of medication schedules, how to recognize when a fever demanded a phone call, or an emergency visit, how to listen carefully to a nurse's suggestion without overstepping. He learned to accept help. Meals left on the porch, friends offering to drive Mia to school when chemotherapy dulled Isabella's energy. He learned the small humility of being cared for in return for caring. Another hearing came months later, not to adjudicate custody anew, but to review compliance with the parenting plan and the social worker's reports. Henry attended, not as a judge but as a father in the gallery, as a man who had helped gather the facts, and who now sat with a ledger of presence to account for his attendance. The reports were favorable. Robert had completed a parenting class, had engaged with a mentor program, and had participated in supervised visits. The social worker recommended continued monitoring and periodic reviews. The judge seemed careful and approved the plan's continuation, with the provision that any backsliding would trigger a stricter review. It was a pragmatic outcome, not dramatic, and Henry felt the relief like a tide shifting. He knew the law's contours were imperfect, but they were there to keep the child safe while offering a path for a father who might yet change. Henry accepted the compromise as a marker of justice that was practical, not theatrical. As months lengthened, and the season shifted, Isabella's health followed a hopeful arc. The language clinicians used was measured, responding well to treatment, entering a period of remission. And Henry took solace in the precision of those words. He did not celebrate as if the world had been rewritten. He celebrated by being present at small, sensible triumphs. A day when Isabella walked farther than the backyard, a morning when she managed a full meal, a night when she read a bedtime story to Mia, with the same sharp tenderness that had comforted hundreds of young patients over the years. When she eventually said, softly, that the oncologist had spoken of remission, the word was almost sacred in its ordinary arrival. It meant that the treatment had done what hope and medicine had both aimed for. A pause long enough to breathe. They did not pretend the future had been guaranteed. They simply allowed themselves the quiet pleasure of distance from the worst. With the legal process and the medical storm leaning toward steadiness, Henry did something he had not allowed himself to imagine before that courtroom laugh. He tendered his retirement. He did not make a spectacle of the decision. There was no dramatic press release. No ona to say lemoni. He signed the papers in a sunlit office, the same small handwriting that had once crafted orders, now shaping a different sort of closure. He wrote a brief letter to colleagues, thanking them for decades of service, and for their steadiness in upholding law. He walked the corridors on his last day with a feeling like unpeeling plaster relief, a hint of grief, and an unaccustomed lightness. At the retirement reception some days later, people spoke of precedents set and opinions authored, of tough cases and the steadiness of decades. Colleagues clinked glasses and told stories in the officious way. Old friends recount shared battles. Henry listened with a politely distant smile, but his attention kept skipping to the corner where Isabella sat, with Mia on her lap, Elizabeth folding a small scarf in her hands. Later, when the room thinned and the speeches tapered off, Isabella stood and crossed the carpet. She took the microphone with the deft control of someone used to addressing both small patients and anxious parents. Her voice was thinner than before, but the clarity was intact. "Dad," she said, and the syllable landed differently than it had that first day. No microphone could contain the human exchange behind the word. "Thank you for coming when it mattered." It was not a declaration of absolution, it was a naming of presence. People took it as something more. Henry felt a warmth that had nothing to do with accolades, and everything to do with being seen. Retirement did not free him from tasks, rather, it reoriented them. He learned the rituals of a home not shaped by chambers but by meals, by school pickup, by the maintenance of a small garden. He learned to fix a leaky faucet. He learned to breathe through nights when fear crept in. He taught Mia how to press seeds into soil and to water, with a care that made little hands solemn. He and Isabella built a habit of Sunday dinners where they ate too much, and argued over inconsequential things: who made the soup too salty, whose turn it was to fold laundry in, till the ordinary friction of family life felt like an exquisite, safe thing. The gray stone remained a talisman. Mia polished it with the thoroughness of someone who understands symbolism as a child's grammar. She put it on a small shelf by Henry's chair, where the winter light would catch it and turn it luminous for an hour each morning. Once, on a porch swing that creaked gently beneath 3 generations of a family, Mia pressed the stone into Henry's palm and announced solemnly that it was his promise rock. "What promise did I make?" he asked. "To come back," she said, as if they'd all understood the contract. "To come back and read and make soup and plant seeds." He kept the promise. When the house felt too full of the old silence, he would take the stone and roll it between his fingers, until the edges smoothed further. It reminded him that redemption, if that was the word for what had happened to him, came in the small, patient repetition of showing up. Years later, when the custody matter had settled into a rhythm of family court reviews and regularized reports, Robert showed intermittent growth and intermittent failures. The shape of a man who had to choose consistently to be present before the court would relax its guard. Supervised visits transitioned to unsupervised visits when the social work reports indicated sustained change. That measured movement was neither cinematic nor simplistic. It was the law doing its careful work, while people did theirs. Isabella's career resumed with new attention to self-care. She returned to work part-time. Then more steadily, she took to coaching younger pediatricians on the fragility of work-life balance and the invisible labor of care. At hospital events, colleagues would ask about the quiet figure who had become an odd sort of office legend, the retired judge who could always be counted on to bring a hearty soup and reliable carpentry skills. Henry, for his part, learned that being present could be unglamorous and profoundly restorative. He learned not to critique the world but to patch it, in small, practical ways. There were ceremonial moments, holiday dinners, a birthday when Henry admitted he had been wrong and Isabella countered that she had always known he loved her in his own way. There were ordinary moments too. Henry teaching Mia how to whistle. Isabella and Henry arguing gently over pruning the roses. Elizabeth arriving with scones and stories that had nothing to do with the bench. Their life together had the comfortable pattern of people who knew one another, who had made and eroded and rebuilt boundaries and trust. In quiet times, Henry would sit with the gray stone in his hand and think about the day Mia had dialed a number from a stranger's phone. He would remember the small, comic absurdity of that instant, and the way it had shattered a curated life. That shattering, he came to believe, was not punishment, but an invitation, a crack in which light could enter. He never forgot the proper bounds of the law. He had recused himself when the personal intersected with the professional, and he had learned to work within institutional channels, to hand off evidence, to facilitate without commandeering. He also never stopped being astonished that a child's small agency, a button saying "bring mommy," could demand so much of an entire life. On a late afternoon when the sun turned the porch railings to gold, Henry sat with Isabella and Mia on the swing, the gray stone on the small table beside them. A breeze made the wind chime sing, in a soft, irregular rhythm. Isabella leaned her head on his shoulder for a moment. Mia hummed under her breath, as children do, a music of small contentments. Elizabeth and Claude, who had become an unlikely friend through the messy business of law and life, joined them with a lemon tart and 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Remember when a phone did everything?" Claude said, half joking, looking at Mia's small fingers tapping the porch floor. Mia smiled, small and smug, as if she knew the power she held. "I made a change," she said. And then, as if explaining an ancient truth, "Phones are magic." Henry took the stone and rolled it once in his palm. "You made more than a change," he said softly. "You made us show up." The sentence was plain. It did not require exaltation. Around them, the ordinary life of a family folded into evening. The table cleared, a plate left for the next day. Lights dimmed. When night came, Henry walked inside with the lamp in his hand and placed it on the bedside table that had once been in his chambers, but now held a different sort of work. A stack of library books, and a little photograph of a birthday cake. He thought of legacy, the speeches and decisions people might read in law, and of the much quieter legacy of being there when someone asked you to bring them home. He had, late in life, traded a robe for a cardigan and a bench for a porch swing. He had learned that authority without presence is brittle, and that the steadiness of a person can matter more than the authority of an office. He had been left in utter disbelief by a child's call, and from that disbelief had come an unglamorous, hard-won willingness to be present. If this story found you, it's because ordinary events sometimes open into the extraordinary. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that showing up messy, imperfect, persist. And if you want more stories that begin in small places and end with human change, subscribe to find the next one.